The wind cut through the underpass like a blade, and Walt Hensley presses back against the concrete pillar, watching his breath turn to fog in the orange glow of the street lamp above him. He had exactly $4.30 in his coat pocket, a folded photograph of a woman who no longer answered his calls, and a leather briefcase that did not belong to him, sitting heavy against his knee like a bomb waiting to go off. He had found it 40 minutes earlier, wedged behind a dumpster outside the High on 5th Street. And the moment he unzipped it and saw the stacks of bound $100 bills inside, his hands had started shaking so hard he nearly dropped the whole thing into the gutter. $60,000. He had counted it twice under the streetlight, his lips moving silently with each stack, and both times the number had come out the same, impossible and terrifying. Tucked beneath the money was a government ID badge with a photograph of a sharp-eyed woman in a navy blazer, and beneath that, a folder stamped with a seal he recognized from the evening news. United States Senate. His stomach turned over. Somewhere in this city, a United States senator was missing $60,000 in the kind of documents that end careers, and Walt Hensley, who had not held a job in 3 years, who slept most nights in a shelter cot or under this very overpass when the shelter was full, was holding all of it in his lap like a live grenade with the pin already pulled. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If this story has already gripped you, if you feel that tightness in your chest wondering what Walt is going to do next, hit that subscribe button right now. Tap the like button and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from tonight. It helps this channel more than you know, and it takes you 3 seconds. Now, let's get back to Walt, because what happens next is going to break your heart before it puts it back together. Walt had not always been a man who slept under bridges. 10 years earlier, he had been a staff sergeant, the kind of soldier younger men looked up to, the kind who carried other men's fear on his own shoulders so they wouldn't have to. He had done 3 tours overseas, and he had come home with all his limbs and none of his peace. The nightmares came first, then the drinking, then the job he lost at the warehouse when he couldn't stop his hands from shaking during a night shift. His wife had tried. God knew she had tried, but there's only so long a person can live with a man who wakes up screaming at 3 a.m. and cannot explain why. She left with her daughter when the girl was 6 years old, and Walt had not seen either of them in 4 years. He kept one photograph of his daughter in his coat pocket, worn soft at the corners from being touched too many times, and some nights that photograph was the only reason he got up off the concrete, and kept walking instead of lying down and letting the cold take him. He looked at the briefcase again. He thought about the shelter down on Grant Street, and how the woman behind the counter there, a kind older lady named Ruth, had told him just that morning that his cot might not be available much longer because the shelter was losing its funding. He thought about how $60,000 could fix more problems than he could count on both hands. He thought about disappearing to another city, getting a room, getting clean, maybe even finding his daughter someday, and showing up at her door as a man instead of a ghost. The thought sat in his chest for a long, tempting moment, and then he thought about the badge, the photograph of the sharp-eyed woman, and the folder full of papers that were clearly not his to read. He thought about the boy he used to be before the war took pieces of him, the boy who believed that a man's word and a man's actions were the only 2 things nobody could ever take away from him. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, his decision was already made, the way it always had been made, quietly, without fanfare, somewhere deep in a part of him the war had never quite managed to touch. He spent that night curled against the pillow with the briefcase locked between his knees, sleeping in 15-minute bursts the way he had learned to sleep in the desert, one eye always half open. In the morning, stiff and frozen, he walked 4 miles to the address printed on a business card he found in the front pocket of the briefcase. The card read Senator Diane Colston, and beneath her name, an office address downtown that Walt had walked past 100 times without ever once imagining he would have a reason to walk inside. The security guard at the front desk took one look at Walt's torn coat, his matted beard, the duct tape holding his left boot together, and stepped in front of him with his hand raised like a traffic cop. Walt did not argue. He simply set the briefcase down on the marble floor, opened it so the guard could see the money and the badge inside, and said in a voice roughened by years of cold nights and cigarette smoke that he needed to speak with whoever handled the senator's lost property, because he believed this belonged to her. The guard's face went through 3 different expressions in about 4 seconds: disbelief, suspicion, and finally something like shame, and he picked up his radio with hands that were not quite steady. 20 minutes later, Walt was sitting in a small waiting room drinking coffee from a paper cup that a young staffer had handed him without quite meeting his eyes, when the door opened and Senator Diane Colston walked in herself. She was exactly as sharp in person as she had looked in the photograph. Dark hair pulled back tight, eyes the color of storm that had not yet decided whether to break. She stopped in the doorway when she saw him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then she looked down at the briefcase sitting on the little table beside him, still closed, still untouched except for the one time he had opened it to prove to the guard he wasn't hiding anything else, and something in her posture shifted. Some tightly wound thing in her shoulders finally let go. She asked him, very quietly, if he had counted the money. Walt told her the truth, that he had counted it twice, because he wanted to be sure what he was giving back before he gave it back, and that every dollar was there. She asked him why, not accusingly, not like an interrogation, but like she genuinely needed to understand what kind of man does what he had just done. Walt looked down at his hands, the same hands that used to hold a rifle steady in places most people only see on the news, and he said that a man who has already lost everything doesn't have much left except the choice of what kind of man he wants to be when nobody's watching. He said his mother used to tell him that character is what you do in the dark, and that he'd spent enough of his life in the dark to know she was right about that. Senator Colston did not say much after that. She thanked him, offered him a reward that he politely refused, and the young staffer walked him back out to the lobby, back out into the cold, back to a life that looked exactly the same as it had the day before, except now there was something warm sitting in his chest that hadn't been there in a very long time. He walked back to the shelter that afternoon expecting nothing more to come of it, expecting the story to end there, the way most good deeds in this world quietly end, unnoticed and unrewarded, which was, if he was honest with himself, exactly the way he preferred it. But Senator Diane Colston was not a woman who let things go quietly, and this is where the story truly begins. She could not stop thinking about him, not about the money, which had been recovered and secured within the hour, but about the man himself, about the way he had looked at her with a kind of quiet dignity that she had not seen in a very long time, not in the marble hallways of the Capitol, not among the donors and lobbyists and career politicians who filled her days with handshakes that meant nothing. She sat at her desk that evening long after her staff had gone home, staring at the security footage from earlier that day, watching Walt Hensley set that briefcase down on the counter without a moment's hesitation, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Shame, not for anything she had done, but for a system that let a man like that end up sleeping under a bridge while men far less honest than him sat in offices just down the hall from hers, wearing suits that cost more than what Walt probably made in half a year back when he still had a paycheck. She pulled up his file the next morning, the one her chief of staff had quietly put together after running his name through the system, and what she read there kept her up half the night. 3 tours of duty, a Purple Heart he had never once mentioned, an honorable discharge, a marriage that had crumbled under the weight of things nobody back home could ever fully understand, a daughter he had not seen in 4 years. She read it twice, then a third time, and by the time the sun came up over the city, she had made a decision that would change both of their lives in ways neither of them could have predicted. She found him 3 days later, not through the shelter, not through official channels, but by walking the same 4 blocks near the underpass herself, wearing a plain gray coat instead of her usual blazer, no security detail trailing behind her, no cameras, nothing but a woman looking for a man who had given her back more than money. She found him sitting on a bench near the shelter, the same worn photograph of his daughter in his hands, and when she sat down beside him, he looked up in surprise, so genuine it nearly broke her heart on the spot. She did not offer him money that day, because she suspected, correctly, that he would refuse it again. Instead, she offered him something else entirely. She told him about a program, one she had actually been quietly working to fund for over a year, designed to give veterans like him not charity, but a second chance, real housing, real job training, real mental health support from people who had actually served themselves and understood what he had been carrying all this time. She told him she wanted him to be the first name on the list, not because of what he had done with the briefcase, though that mattered too, but because after reading his file she believed the country owed him more than it had given him, and she intended to start paying that debt herself if the system wouldn't. Walt sat there for a long moment, quiet, The way he always got quiet when something mattered too much to trust his voice right away. He told her he didn't need pity. She told him this wasn't pity. This was overdue. And there was a difference. She told him that watching him hand back that briefcase without a moment's hesitation had reminded her why she'd run for office in the first place, before the fundraisers and the compromises and the slow, grinding weight of politics had worn some of that idealism down to a nub, and that she owed him something for that too, something that had nothing to do with money at all. He said yes. Quietly, almost reluctantly. The way a man says yes when he has forgotten how to hope for anything, and is terrified of what it might cost him to start hoping again. What followed over the next several weeks was not some overnight miracle, because life rarely works that way, and Diane Colston was not interested in telling Walt Hensley a lie dressed up as a kindness. There was paperwork. There were setbacks. There was a night 3 weeks into the program when Walt nearly walked away from all of it, when the weight of his own memories caught up with him in the middle of the night, and he found himself standing outside the transitional housing unit at 2 a.m, keys in his hand, ready to disappear back into the streets, because the streets, for all their cruelty, at least asked nothing of him. It was Diane herself who found him there, having been called by the night staff who knew by then, to call her directly if anything seemed wrong. She did not lecture him. She sat down on the curb next to him in her expensive coat, ruining the hem in the wet gutter without seeming to care at all, and she simply asked him to tell her about his daughter. He talked for almost an hour, about the little girl who used to fall asleep on his chest during thunderstorms, about the day she was born and the way his hands had shaken holding her, not from fear of the war he had not yet gone to, but from a joy so enormous it had felt dangerous, about the last time he had seen her, 7 years old, waving at him through the back window of a car driving away, and the 4 years of silence since. Diane listened to every word without interrupting once, and when he finally finished, she told him something that would end up changing the entire direction of his life. She told him that if he truly wanted to be the kind of father that little girl deserved, walking away tonight would not accomplish that. But staying and fighting to the hard part just might. She told him she had people, resources, connections she rarely used for anything personal, and that if he wanted, she would help him find his daughter, not to force his way back into her life, but to at least give him the chance to write her a letter, to let her know he was still out here, still trying, still her father in every way that mattered. He went back inside that night, and 3 weeks later, with Diane's quiet help, he found out that his daughter, now 11 years old, was living 2 states away with his ex-wife and her new husband, and that his ex-wife, when Diane's team reached out carefully and respectfully, had cried on the phone and said she had always hoped Walt would find his way back, because their daughter still asked about him sometimes, still kept an old photograph of the two of them tucked into her nightstand drawer. Now here comes a twist that nobody saw coming, the part of the story that turned an already remarkable act of kindness into something the entire country would soon be talking about. Word got out, not because Diane wanted it to, and certainly not because Walt did, but because a junior staffer, eager to make a name for himself, leaked a rough version of the story to a local reporter, hoping to make his boss look good ahead of an upcoming re-election campaign. Within days, the story of the homeless veteran who returned a senator's $60,000 briefcase, only to be tracked down and personally helped by that very senator, exploded across every major news outlet in the country. Cameras showed up outside the transitional housing unit. Reporters camped outside Diane's office. And overnight, Walt Hensley, a man who 3 weeks earlier could not get a shelter volunteer to remember his name, became a symbol, a headline, a hashtag, the honest homeless hero. They called him, and Diane Colston became, almost against her will, the caring senator who proved that politicians could still have a soul. But fame, as Walt was about to learn, is a double-edged sword that cuts just as deep as it shines. Old enemies of Senator Colston, political rivals who had spent years looking for any weakness to exploit, seized on a story and twisted it into something ugly. They accused her of staging the entire thing, of paying a homeless actor to manufacture a feel-good headline right before a tough election, of using a broken man's misfortune as a campaign prop. Reporters who had once written glowing pieces about Walt's honesty suddenly turned their cameras on his past instead, digging up old military records, old arrest reports from his darkest drinking years, painting him not as a hero, but as a desperate man who might have orchestrated the whole thing himself for a payday and a headline. Walt watched it all unfold from a small television in the housing unit's common room, his hands clenched so tight around a coffee mug that his knuckles went white. And for the first time since he had walked into that Senate office with a briefcase full of someone else's money, he felt the old darkness creeping back in, the same darkness that used to send him reaching for a bottle just to make the noise in his head stop. He believed in that moment that he had made a terrible mistake, that he should have simply stayed invisible, that a man like him was never meant to be seen by the world, only used by it and then discarded. He packed his few belongings into the same bag. He had carried them in for years, and he was one hand on the doorknob away from disappearing entirely, from letting the streets swallow him back up where at least nobody expected anything of him. When Diane Colson herself walked through that door, no cameras, no staff, no security, just her, out of breath from having driven across town the moment she heard from the shelter director that Walt was packing to leave. She did not try to stop him with words at first. She simply stood in the doorway and let him see her face, exhausted, worried, genuinely afraid of losing something that had come to matter to her far beyond politics or headlines. Then she told him something that stopped him cold with his hand still on that doorknob. She told him that she did not care what the reporter said, that she did not care what it cost her career, because she had spent 15 years in politics compromising pieces of herself for votes and donors and approval ratings, and the day he walked into her office with that briefcase was the first time in longer than she could remember that she had felt like the person she used to be before all of that started. She told him that if he walked out that door now, the only person who would win would be every cynical voice that had ever told either of them that good, honest people don't get happy endings in this world, and she refused, absolutely refused, to let those voices be right. Walt turned around slowly, the bag still hanging from his shoulder, tears he had not allowed himself to cry in years finally breaking free down his weathered face, and he asked her the question that had been eating at him from the moment the cameras first showed up. He asked her why she was fighting so hard for a broken-down soldier nobody else wanted. And Diane Colson, Senator of the United States, a woman who had built her entire career on careful, measured words chosen for maximum political safety, said something completely unguarded for perhaps the first time in her adult life. She said that she wasn't fighting for a broken-down soldier. She was fighting for the only person in this entire city who had ever shown her, without asking for a single thing in return, exactly what real character looked like. And she was not about to let the world take that away from either of them without a fight. He set the bag down. That she had felt like the person she used to be before all of that started. She told him that if he walked out that door now, the only person who would win would be every cynical voice that had ever told either of them that good, honest people don't get happy endings in this world. And she refused, absolutely refused, to let those voices be right. Walt turned around slowly, the bag still hanging from his shoulder, tears he had not allowed himself to cry in years finally breaking free down his weathered face, and he asked her the question that had been eating at him from the moment the cameras first showed up. He asked her why she was fighting so hard for a broken-down soldier nobody else wanted. And Diane Colson, Senator of the United States, a woman who had built her entire career on careful, measured words chosen for maximum political safety, said something completely unguarded for perhaps the first time in her adult life. She said that she wasn't fighting for a broken-down soldier. She was fighting for the only person in this entire city who had ever shown her, without asking for a single thing in return, exactly what real character looked like, and she was not about to let the world take that away from either of them without a fight. He set the bag down. The following weeks were not easy, because real redemption never is, but they were, in their own quiet way, extraordinary. Diane went public herself, holding a press conference where she laid out the entire truth without spin or polish, admitting there had been no staging, no manufactured story, just one honest man's choice meeting one tired public servant's overdue gratitude. She spoke about the veteran housing program not as a campaign talking point, but as something she intended to fight for regardless of what it cost her politically, and something about the raw honesty of that press conference, so different from the careful nothing statement politicians usually give, caught fire in a way none of her advisors expected. Public opinion, which had briefly turned against her, swung back hard in her favor, not because people suddenly trusted politicians again, but because for once they had watched one act like an actual human being. And then came the twist that made this story truly unforgettable, the moment that turned this from a heartwarming headline into something people will be talking about for years to come. 3 months after Walt first walked into that Senate office, Diane arranged something she had been quietly working on behind the scenes the entire time, without telling Walt a single word about it, terrified of getting his hopes up in case it fell through. She had been in careful, gentle contact with his ex-wife for weeks, and on a cold Saturday afternoon, she invited Walt to what he believed was simply a small gathering to celebrate the official launch of the veteran housing program bearing his name. He arrived in a donated suit that fit him for the first time in years, his beard trimmed, his eyes clearer than they had been in a decade, and he was shaking Diane's hand and thanking the small crowd of supporters gathered in the community center when the back doors opened. A car had pulled up outside, and standing in the doorway, holding the hand of an 11-year-old girl with his same eyes and his same stubborn chin, was his ex-wife, tears already streaming down her face before she had even said a word. Walt froze completely. The room around him seemed to disappear entirely. Every reporter, every supporter, every camera flash fading into meaningless static, because the only thing that existed in that moment was a little girl standing in the doorway, staring at a father she had not seen since she was 7 years old, uncertain, hopeful, terrified in the exact same way he was. She said one word, "Dad," and the sound of it broke something open in Walt Hensley that 4 years of homelessness, 3 tours of war, and a lifetime of quiet suffering had never quite managed to break. He crossed that room in 3 long strides and dropped his knees in front of her, and when she threw her arms around his neck, sobbing into his shoulder, he held her the way a drowning man holds onto the only solid thing left in an ocean that had been trying to swallow him whole for years. There was not a dry eye left in that community center. Even the reporters, hardened as they were to every kind of story, found themselves wiping their faces, because some moments are simply too honest, too human, to stand at a professional distance from. But this story does not end there, and here is where I need you to lean in close, because the final twist is the one that nobody, not even Diane herself, saw coming until the very last moment. As Walt knelt there holding his daughter, his ex-wife stepped forward and knelt down beside them, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. She told him, quietly, that she had never stopped believing he could find his way back, and that watching the news coverage over the past few months, watching him choose honesty when it would have been so easy to disappear with that money, had reminded her of the man she had originally fallen in love with before the war had buried him under everything it left behind. She told him that she and her husband had talked, carefully, seriously, and that if Walt was willing to keep doing the hard work of healing, truly healing, not just performing recovery for the cameras, there was room in their daughter's life for her father again, not to replace anything, but to add back something that little girl had been quietly missing every single day for 4 years. Walt looked up at Diane Colston across the room. This woman who had walked into his broken life on nothing more than principle and stubborn hope, and he mouthed 2 silent words to her. "Thank you." Diane, watching from across the room with tears of her own sliding freely down her face, simply nodded, because some debts, she had come to understand, are not meant to be repaid with money at all. They are meant to be repaid by becoming, in some small way, a better version of the person the world had convinced you that you no longer had the right to be. The veteran housing program launched that day now bears a name that has since become recognized in cities across the country, a name attached to hundreds of formerly homeless veterans who have found housing, treatment, and dignity because one exhausted man chose to walk 4 miles on a freezing morning to return $60,000 that was never his to keep. Senator Diane Colston went on to become one of the most trusted voices in the entire Senate, not because of any clever campaign strategy, but because the public had watched her prove, in the most public way imaginable, that she meant every word she had ever said about integrity mattering more than image. And Walt Hensley, the man who once slept curled against a concrete pillow with nothing but a worn photograph and a broken heart to keep him company, now spends his mornings walking his daughter to school 2 blocks from the small home the program helped him secure, the same daughter who, every single night before bed, makes him promise to tell her the story again, the one about the briefcase, and the choice her father made in the freezing dark, when absolutely nobody was watching, the choice. That changed both of their lives forever. If this story moved you even half as much as it moved me writing it, I need you to do one last thing before you go. Comment below and tell me which moment hit you hardest. The reunion at the community center, the curb outside the shelter, or the very first moment Walt decided to walk those for miles instead of disappearing. Share this with someone who needs a reminder tonight that honesty still matters in this world. And subscribe, because there are so many more stories like this one still waiting to be told. And I promise you, the next one might just be even more unforgettable than this.